Around the same period of time, Jiu-jitsu and Judo began being transmitted from Japan to the United States around the turn of the last century. But what was Jiu-jitsu and what was Judo during this time? That's one of my favorite questions because it gets into the question of when does one martial art become another? I have a short answer to that question, and that comes at the end of this video. And we'll have longer answers and deeper dives, of course, but first I want to share some of my favorite general judo history texts. The first is Judo Memoirs of Jigoro Kano, translated by Brian Watson. It's one of my favorite books because you get to hear the word straight from the man himself, the person I consider the most important and influential and admirable martial artist, certainly of the last 100 years, probably of the last 500 years, and maybe ever. Some really fascinating stuff here. I also recommend Bruce and Matsumoto's Judo in the US. It's about the first 100 years of judo in America, and a lot of scholars consider it the definitive work. But my favorite, bar none, is the great John Stevens' The Way of Judo. This is an incredible portrait of Kano and his students. It has lots of details, really scholarly, reliable, and a bunch of stuff that you just can't find anywhere else, so check it out. For this video, though, we're going to talk about early jiu-jitsu and judo in America from 1900 to 1906 and how those arts were represented, both by the practitioners themselves and how they were represented in the media. Among the prominent figures of judo and jiu-jitsu at this time, we can divide them into basically three categories. The folks that had trained at the Kodokan and were explicit representatives of Kodokan Judo, you can see some of these listed up here, and folks who had never trained judo at all but were jiu-jitsu representatives. There's a third category, folks who had probably trained both, or we can reliably say trained multiple martial arts. If you're a fan of judo history, you'll almost definitely recognize all of these names. The Yamashitas are legends, and Yoshiaki, also known as Yoshitsugu Yamashita, was one of the four guardians of the Kodokan, so-called, and an explicit Kodokan representative. Tsunejiro Tomita, also a legend, was reportedly Jigoro Kano's first training partner, and Mitsuyo Maeda, who's claimed by both judo and jiu-jitsu, is of course possibly the grandfather of Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which we won't talk about until much later in this sequence because that happened decades later. Then there's a second category, people that definitely did not train Kodokan Judo, even though a couple of these people claimed falsely to have, and we'll deep dive into that at some point soon. You may recognize some of these names. Katsugumi Higashi was one of the first jiu-jitsu stars in America. John O'Brien was President Roosevelt's first jiu-jitsu instructor. Tengen Uchimura almost certainly founded the first jiu-jitsu school in America, and Irving Hancock wrote 4 books about jiu-jitsu and 1 about judo, even though there's no evidence he ever trained either of them. Then there are folks who are trained in both. Mitsuyo Maeda is probably the most famous and controversial example. He definitely trained some jiu-jitsu, definitely trained some sumo, and was definitely a Kodokan judoka. There are reasons for why he, at a certain point, would represent one over the other, including that Kano famously disapproved not only of professional fighting, which Maeda did and wanted to do, but even taking part in public entertainment for personal gain. He believed you could only do that for education. Maeda had other goals, and we're not going to open that can of worms right now, but let's just say he had a background in multiple martial arts. By the way, that's from the awesome John Stevens book that I referenced at the start of the video. The Kodokan judoka were consistently good, especially, of course, the legendary Yamashita. The Kodokan had a curriculum, it had teaching goals, it was run by Kano, who was a career educator, and so there was consistent excellence there. Yamashita was also an incredible tough guy, and as the great martial arts historian Joseph Spence, Professor Yamashita Goes to Washington, reports, he once reportedly fought off 17 dudes in an assault. Could be apocryphal, definitely badass. By contrast, the skills of the jiu-jitsu folks varied widely because there were multiple schools of jiu-jitsu, and no one's really sure exactly where or how much a lot of these folks trained. And like I said, there's no evidence that Hancock trained at all. We're going to do a lot of videos on Katsugumi Higashi because he was the first jiu-jitsu star in America and as such is very historically significant. We know he didn't train judo, but had trained at least some jiu-jitsu for a couple of reasons. First, he did have some skills. He threw a police strongman named Ajax, which we'll talk about a lot during the course of the class, and he beat several catch wrestlers. We also know he trained jiu-jitsu and not judo because he claimed to have trained judo. What? I will explain. This is an article from March 21, 1905, where Higashi claims to be a pupil of the great Kano and that Kano would teach him fatal tricks that he wouldn't teach anyone else for a few years. By then, people started to know what judo was, and it was becoming marketable. So Higashi and Irving Hancock created a book called The Real Kano Jiu-Jitsu, which was purported to be all the judo he was teaching. Unfortunately for Higashi, the man himself found out about it and wrote a letter about it, which is included in the cover leaf of the English version of their book, The Real Kano Jiu-Jitsu. This is reproduced from John Stevens' book, and basically Kano says, hey, this says it's my stuff, but this is not the judo I teach. This is the old school jiu-jitsu from feudal Japan, which tells us both that Higashi was being dishonest about training with Kano and that the stuff he was teaching was jiu-jitsu from old-time Japan. The thing is, from 1900 to about 1904, almost all of this stuff was universally being described as jiu-jitsu. So imagine you're a newspaper reporter and you see Yamashita, and for the last 3.5 years, you've been told the Japanese art of wrestling is called jiu-jitsu, and there's been a nationwide media push saying, hey, this stuff that the Japanese do is jiu-jitsu, and then you see a guy doing an uchimata. You're probably going to describe it as jiu-jitsu. And so even Yamashita had his stuff described as jiu-jitsu for several years before he started pushing back. Yeah, this one is from early January in 1905. Reporters eventually start listening to him and they make a distinction between judo and jiu-jitsu. And it's interesting to me to see how this is framed. You'll see Yamashita framing judo as a higher development than the art of jiu-jitsu, and reporters listening. Later in January and February 1905, you start seeing newspapers frame it using Yamashita and Kano's framing as being more merciful, more gentle, less brutal, less savage, and more gentlemanly than the coarser art of jiu-jitsu. The media representations here are really interesting to me because you get to see both the perspective of the people transmitting the art and the people receiving those transmissions and observing it from afar. So here you see Yamashita telling a reporter that judo is better than jiu-jitsu because it is more skillful, less savage, less likely to injure someone. And the reporter, and this appears in like 2 or 3 newspapers at the time, communicates that Yamashita choked a person for a full hour. He was unconscious for a full hour, and then he restored him with bad results. Judo and jiu-jitsu are magic. So 2 things to close this out. First, it's sometimes really easy to tell what is judo and what is jiu-jitsu. Some people were explicit representatives of the Kodokan. Some people had never ever trained judo, and we know that from multiple sources. Some folks were someplace in the middle. Then there were people like Tengen Uchimura, who was explicitly a jiu-jitsu representative, but also had nasty things to say about Katsugume Higashi and other jiu-jitsu practitioners, which raises the question, how much jiu-jitsu had all of these folks trained anyway? And we'll tackle that in a different video.